very much thank you to TEDx and Hult Business School for inviting me to this event. It's a great pleasure to be here and share some of my thoughts for you. Looking at China, for those who have either lived in China or done business with China over the years, one of the things that strike you is kind of a information overload. There is today so much information in all channels about China, so it is hard to deconstruct what is important for you, what is important for your business. So on the topic of rethinking China as the event for today, I thought of highlighting 3 small stories where I try to pinpoint a few of the key indicators of the Chinese economy that is often misunderstood. So I will tell you 3 short stories, a little bit of a timeline, short, medium, long-term view. First, Xi Jinping, he can represent the short term. He's going to be in power for the next 10 years. Chinese growth was always 8% when Wen Jiabao was the premier. Today is said to be 7%, but what is the right growth for China and what does it mean for you or your business? A little bit more in the medium term when this little guy might grow up. Will he be a consumer? Will the consumers of China save the day of the Chinese economy, make it sustainable? That's the second thing I will look briefly into. And in the long term, who is number one? Will China simply take over from the United States to become the biggest economy in the world, and will they then remain so for eternity? I do not think so. Before I start, a little bit of background. For those living in China, you might be familiar with this. There was a leadership change this winter. The old administration with Hu Jintao and Jiabao on top, the new one with Xi Jinping, Li Keqiang at the bottom. For people not familiar with China, not Chinese, it might be quite hard to spot the difference. As one of my friends said, maybe they've done a little bit of cost cutting. There's less people and there's less plants in the picture. But I think there's more substantial changes than that taking place. In the Hu Jintao administration, the balance between the fractions in the party was quite equal. It was 4-5. In the new administration, Xi Jinping and his fraction, his backers, are actually 5 or even some say 5.5 out of the 7. So the power base that Xi Jinping has for the coming decade is much stronger than what Hu Jintao had in his tenure. Also, for those who remember, when Hu Jintao became president, he became both the head of the party and head of the state 10 years ago, but he had to wait 2 years before he got the also third important position as head of military. Xi Jinping has all these positions from day one, and I think that is important to see how China tackled the challenges ahead, that they have a leadership that is more uniform and stronger than the previous one. However, in the years to come, there are many challenges facing China. Europe is one. Europe used to be the biggest export market for China. Asia is now taking over for that. There is homegrown problems. We read a lot about the property prices. People in Shanghai are very familiar with that. Local government investment vehicles. A lot of headlines pointing towards challenges ahead for China. Another one is overcapacity, here exemplified with the solar industry. And then the reoccurring theme of, is there overinvestment? Maybe not so easy to see, but this is the GDP growth for China over the last decade or so. This is quarterly numbers, a little bit more choppy, but the average, as all know, has been close to 10% growth for 3 decades, and in the last few years, 8% growth. However, if you only go 2 years back, China grew at about 9%, and everyone was kind of looking at, is this economy overheating? A year later or so, the growth had slowed down to about 7.9, and then everyone started talking about a hard landing. So I guess the good growth for China is somewhere between 9 and 7.9%, somewhere between overheating and a hard landing. However, if you do business either in China or with China, I would argue that the GDP figure is not so relevant for you. Because if you look beyond that figure, the deviation between sectors and regions are quite large. If you look at the solar industry, or the new green industries, solar, wind, today they are in have massive challenges. So with some older industries like shipbuilding. If you look at the service sector, maybe into healthcare, maybe into elderly care, many sectors grow with double digits and a lot more. So what's important for you and your business is not necessarily how fast China is growing, but how well is the economy doing within the sector that is most important for you. So a little bit like looking at Europe and say, should I do business in Europe? They have maybe 0, maybe 1% growth, but the difference, of course, about setting up business in Greece, setting up business in Germany is large. If we look a little bit longer, medium term, and talk about consumption, many economists today argue that China has to change their business model. They have to go from the investment-led, export-oriented growth model that they had in the last decades into a more consumer-based economy. The prerequisite for this is often said to be political reform or even economic liberalization. I think both those factors could be good and those factors could contribute to a change toward consumerism, but I would argue that it's not necessarily needed. If you look at the West and if you look at the US, the economy with the highest proportion of consumption to GDP today is America. In America, if you are 8, 10 years old, you probably have an iPhone. If you're 70-year-old, you probably play golf, you might have a second home or go down to Florida for the winter. The point is, of course, not everyone does this, but the point is that the entire spectrum of the population are to one extent or the other a potential consumer. In China, on the other hand, I argue that consumers are mostly found within the younger generation between 20 and 40. Making a very simplified argument, but looking back, or looking at China, looking at the enormous economic growth that's taken place for the last few decades, and also looking at the 60s and 70s where people did not have the same education opportunities, people above 40 today do not have the same purchasing power and opportunity for consuming as the younger generation. However, making a very simple argument that those aged 35 to 40 today, in 10 years' time or in 20 years' time, they will simply continue to consume, whereas the new cohorts growing into becoming 18, 20, 22-year-olds, they will become new consumers. So, making a simple argument out of demographics, in only 20 years' time, the cohorts in China that has potential consumers will practically double from about 400 million to 750 million in only 20 years. To make a similar argument, and this I borrow from The Economist, many economists say that 5,000 US dollars, or approximately 30,000 renminbi, is a tipping point of average disposable income before consumption takes off in a society. If I may ask the audience, which city was the first one in China to reach this level of disposable income? Anyone? Shenzhen. That was close. It was Dongguan in 2008. But if we continue to click in the years to come, we see that because of the high growth in China, very, very rapidly, the map is filled with dots of cities that have reached an average disposable income of 30,000 renminbi, which is seen as a tipping point for consumption. And everyone here, everyone been to China, we know that even if you have not heard about some of these cities, you know that it's not a little city with a couple of 100,000 people, it's most likely an area with 3, 5, 8 million people. So again, also from the economics point of view, if growth overall continue only for a few more years, most of China will reach an average income level that will make consumption a much more important part of the economy. My argument is simple. Economic liberalization or political reform will probably support more consumption, but it's not needed at all. Demographics alone and continued growth for a few more years will make consumption a much, much more important factor of GDP in China only 10 years from now. If GDP overall is 8%, 5%, or even lower in a few years' time, I'm not arguing that. I'm just saying that consumption will become an important part, and it will be a driver of growth in China, just as in the West in the near future. To make one more argument, called in the long run, who's number one? Many have probably seen this from The Economist. Maybe someone has been on their website and put in some figures themselves, but they made a model where you can put in some growth numbers for China, some growth number from the US, and you can predict what year will China overtake the US. If I put in 7.5 for China, 2.5 for the US, the result is 2020, based on a few simple assumptions, of course. But for those, or anyone reading the internet, reading newspapers, reading analytical reports, when will China overtake the US has kind of been a headline for almost 10 years now. And it's been kind of taken as a fact. It's repeated so many times that when I read it today, it almost feels like when the year comes, and it will come soon, after that, China will continue to grow and continue to overtake the US and become the #1 dominant leading economy in the world. No one has yet said what happens after they become #1. And I think, again, to use population or demographic as one simple key of data, it is possible to make certain assumptions. Today, China is about 1.35 million people. We all know that the Chinese population is about to peak, and then, according to a UN estimate, drop sharply over the next 80, 90 years. On the other hand, the US economy, today about 300 million people, is growing and growing quite rapidly. Today, America is about 23% population-wise of China. If you look 90 years into the future, America will have a population more than half the size of China. To me, those simple facts make it pretty clear that it will be very difficult for China to outgrow the US in the decades ahead, and it might actually be in the reverse. For in the decades that lies ahead of us, if China soon peak population and then slowly start to shrink their population down towards 1 billion people, China will have a big aging part of their population that will be increasing. The cheap labor that we've seen in China for the last decade will no longer be here because it will be more likely to be labor shortage. So China will definitely not be the factory of the world a couple of decades from now. And these challenges with an older population and also the environment as a factor I have not talked about, I think that China will be a strong economy going forward, but most likely the United States have a much better potential with a young population, a growing population, and also a population and an economy over the decades that have shown very adaptable to change. So if I may end with a short prediction, since I'm European, I put EU as the largest economy today. If you look into IMF figures, etc., it is actually said as the largest economy today, but if you look at a country basis, it is of course the United States. So somewhere before 2025, China will take over as the world's largest economy. I think everyone agrees upon that. If it happens in 2018, 2022, 2025, not so important. It will happen very soon, not only within our lifetime, but within the years ahead of us. But then I will argue that only based on demographics alone, when we get somewhere around 2050, the middle of this century, America and the population dividend and the demographics of America probably makes it very likely that America will regain the position as the largest economy in the world, and they will remain so for the rest of this century. Does that mean anything negative or bad for China? I don't think so. It will be two economies fairly large, fairly much larger than the rest for the rest of this decade, but it will not be a century of China alone. America has a lot more in it, and they will be the largest economy for most of this century. Thank you very much.